Hi, welcome back to my channel. This is the second in the series of why you're bad at coding. And if you haven't seen the first video, please do so. This video does stand alone, but I think they're better off handled as a series because I explained in the first video why I started looking at this topic of why people are bad at coding. To summarize, I've always been interested in why people are good at what they do, how to make the average programmer better at what they do. And since I hadn't looked at that in quite some time, it's also very good to ask, why are people not good at it right now? And that's what inspired this series. So we looked at two things in the part one, and we're going to start off with the third one. Reason three, you're bad at programming is you're in a Scrum or some variation of questionable Agile practice. Or worse yet, you're in yet another Scrum or some other variation of some questionable Agile practice. Now, I will admit, because I did a lot of work on UML, that I do have a bone to pick here, because the Agile people kind of put what we were doing alongside the unified software development process stuff kind of in the crosshairs. And rightfully so. It was a big consortium of companies that were doing this, and we were kind of pushing this as potentially the one true way of doing things, and some of us more than others. Some of us were actually thinking, well, this is a good way of doing things, and putting all this stuff out here and standardizing is not a good way of doing this, or just not having all these crazy, 20, 25 different ways to design object-oriented programs. We thought that was a kind of good thing, but they put this target on us, and basically, they said, okay, we want to do all these types of things. The reason now looking back on it, is to be perfectly blunt. What Agile has done in terms of basically really making how people develop software completely uniform, but with even less accountability and actually being way more difficult on programmers, while actually taking less and less feedback from programmers, has been the whole Agile thing in the light of Scrum. And it's one of those things where I can't say that if we, the big process guys, the UML guys had won, that things would be better, but I would be hard pressed to think that they would be worse. Um, and I would actually take the bet on, going back to the old days in some respects than keeping what's going on now and trying to just keep doing that. And the reason being is that we're seeking more input from developers on how they did things day to day and trying to provide them actual tools to do their jobs and more ideas to do their jobs. Scrum has just been completely taken over by project management and consultants, and they just don't care what people do the day-to-day type of stuff, because it's one of those things where they think they have the answer, and they don't realize that it's like, oh, wait a minute, people don't look at the manifesto and really customize these things. No, they don't, because you keep telling them to do the exact same things over and over and over and over again, and then when they don't work, blaming them for not improvising when they needed to instead of just following what was given to them as recommendations. It's one of those things where there's no accountability there. And so that's what I think is just. So I will rag on Agile and Scrum all day. And because, yes, part of it is sour grapes, but B, it's not making the average developer's life any better. It's really, really making it worse. And because the pace is just unsustainable. I've talked about this before, but Kent Beck, when he wrote the thing Extreme Programming, picked a good name for it. And Extreme Programming was kind of the thing that created this impetus around the whole Agile type of thing, which is basically, let's just focus on the core things that we do as programmers. And the thing about it is they kind of didn't ignore Kent's warning, which is basically, maybe this is not for everybody. But even Kent had this big thing where he said, you do this 40 hours a week. You don't do it 41, you do it 40 hours a week. Now, with all respect to Kent, he was wrong. The answer should have been 32. Um, Basically, those people were very good and diligent, stuff like that. But if you do that kind of intensity and focus and stuff like that for 40 hours a week, that isn't sustainable. Really, the average person can really only do that kind of work 30 hours a week. And there's lots of studies out there that have kind of shown that basically, in given the modern environment we're in, the 32-hour work week is really the best kind of sweet spot for people to really be the most productive and still have, still have a working economy. So, and not only that, but it's basically one of those things where it also discounts when you have really, really talented programmers that happen to get together on a project. You can get good outcomes if they manage to gel as a team. But that if they manage to gel as a team does not necessarily mean that what they did as a team is repeatable or even useful. And what's going to happen to you is if you're in a scrum, you're going to constantly start thinking that you're not good at programming because you're constantly having to cut corners, forgoing good practices, documentation, and all this stuff, just to have enough time to yourself outside of work. So how to get better? Honestly, don't bother in this case. If you're in a scrum and this kind of stuff, and you're in this kind of environment, and there's not enough wiggle room for you to get out of it in terms of your working day, um, to really make it happen, use the time elsewhere for other hobbies, or doing a pivot to maybe an environment that would be a little bit better, especially if you're in an environment that is particularly noxious in terms of how it works, in terms of expecting programmers to look busy, versus actually be busy and not realize that they also want to learn new things and need to be trained and develop new skills. Because in this case, good enough is often good enough. And if you're really trapped on this treadmill, but if you're keeping up, I can't fault you for just staying there in terms of skill sets. It seems almost kind of cruel to say it's like, well, you need to get better at programming, 10x coder. Yeah, well, you need to be able to catch your breath to be able to do that kind of stuff. Okay, reason number 4, and I struggle to find a better term for this, but it's you don't know what you don't know. It's basically this concept of basically incomplete understanding, um, meets overconfidence. And it's hard to really do that because basically it's hard to explain to somebody, oh, you don't know about this thing that you don't know about and why it matters is really kind of difficult. But if you have those blind spots really are maybe what's preventing you from becoming a better programmer. And what's interesting for me is a lot of times those blind spots have nothing to do about coding skills. And so you might not have any blind spots there, but you might have a lot of blind spots around other types of things. Me personally, I was really bad at interpersonal politics and relations, and I never really got the support or took the time to become better at those types of things. Partly because I didn't understand them, but two, if you look at how I organized my career in my education, my goal was to actually be much more independent in terms of being a professor, as a researcher, and a teacher. So, I kind of was trying to hopefully set myself up to be on that path, or to basically be a manager or mentor or technical manager at some point. Unfortunately, what it was is that I was good enough at programming the day to day, and that paid well enough. That's what I ended up getting hired for. And in a lot of cases, I either got brought in and then the projects were basically scaled back. I had a run of bad luck. But in other cases, it's literally, well, you do a good enough job that we don't want to replace you, and other things. So, and of course, I don't work now because of personal health reasons. Um, I won't get into that here in this video. But even worse, you may not be that bad at all. You actually might be quite good at coding, really. So here's the thing. Let's just admit that it's really hard to judge what it means to be good at coding. There's no way you can do it in a quantitative sense of like, well, you are a 6 out of 10 and this person is an 8 out of 10. That doesn't even exist. So it's much more shades of experience, comfort level, and things like that. Now, the actual worst case scenario is I only bring it up here because if you are this person, you won't know it anyway. I just want to let other people know that these people do exist. They're more common than you think, and they are harder to deal with, and they are more of a drag on your day-to-day life in the workplace than you would think. There are a lot of people out there that actually aren't very skilled and insist that they are. Basically, you're not. Basically, you're not very skilled, but you will insist that you are, and nobody could ever change your mind because if they were actually good, they would be agreeing with you all the time. There's nothing you can do about these types of people. It's nigh impossible to do anything because anything that you try to do to show them that there's things that they're missing, you will just backfire on you. The thing you can do is just best, if you're having to deal with something like this, best collect a paper trail and make a case for getting them fired when the times get a little bit more lean. But why is it worse that if you're good enough at coding versus like just not knowing certain things and wanting to learn things? Why it's worse is that the self-doubt you might have about your skills, combined with the opinions about others who may not be the most objective about that for various reasons, will really be a big hamper to your work. It is almost an invisible drag on you. If you're kind of worried about being good enough, it's going to make just doing the job harder. In the worst case, people will have legitimate imposter syndrome, where they are in constant fear of being found out as actually a fraud, and just a complete charlatan, and will be called out any single day on it. And of course, the irony there that imposter syndrome is often felt by people who have staggeringly amounts of competencies. They are really good at certain types of things. And sometimes it's that level of performance that they're at is what brings in the doubt. Is like, how could anybody think that they're this good at something or be this lucky? And some of that doubt is healthy, but at the end of the day, it can't stop you from performing at that level if you can. And so, you have to balance that with a set of, well, you know what, I can do certain things and I can perform on a certain level, and it's okay to accept that and be proud of that without being arrogant. And not only that, but being honest about having skill set gaps, is increasingly just not acceptable in for a lot of people in terms of workforce stuff. You have to kind of seem like if you don't have to be a know-it-all, but you kind of have to seem like, oh well, I will always figure out what I need to know and I won't need anybody's help. Yeah, that's just really not sustainable either. The best people at their jobs are the ones that are constantly asking questions, not the ones that always think they have the answers. So how to get better at this? Okay, now if you do really need to say, I want to go the next step in my career and I need to get there. Um, the only thing I say is you're going to have to make a plan to do it. In terms of an end goal, at a really realistic end goal. Not basically it's one of those things where like, oh, I like to actually change my position to this, or I want to be able to move into using these certain technologies or join this group. And again, do this as much as humanly possible in company time, and otherwise time box it fairly strictly outside of those work hours. And the reason being I say that is like, do not feel bad that you are still doing what you need to do in terms of your daily requirements on a job in being okay. You're not finding extra work for yourself to do, but instead investing in yourself to become a better asset. Well, any company that's really worth working for would have already been helping you to do that with, because they want you to be able to do that kind of stuff and be able to actually add on more add on more basically take on more tasks and do things and mentor other people. Good companies want to do that. They're increasingly rare, so you just have to kind of do it on the fly sometimes. And hopefully you'll get some support from some manager or maybe your direct reports at some point. And not only that, but if your colleagues start asking about them, be really honest about why you're doing it, because they might be in the same boat. Okay, so that kind of, for people that are experienced in the workforce, I think that's kind of the four major things I wanted to talk about why you are bad at coding and how to get better. There's certain little things about that, but those are really much more about how you develop the soft skills to make you more successful in your career and have nothing to do with the day-to-day grind of writing programs that work. So, but there's this whole other category that is out there. There are people that are now new to the workforce that have graduated and are trying to find work, and they're having a harder and harder time doing it. And this is not a new phenomenon. These bust and boom cycles happen all the time. I was part of a major layoff during the first dot-com crash at HP. I was 15,000 people out of a combined 100,000 people from two companies. Really brutal amount of layoffs. The whole companies and businesses disappearing, and the level layoffs now that you've seen has reached that level. It's much less obvious, because as a percentage, it may not seem as impressive. In the dot-com days, there's fewer of those companies, so that was a lot more jobs as terms of a whole percentage of the workforce. But there's still a lot of people that have been losing work and a lot of jobs that aren't there anymore. It's really bad. And the thing about it is that I can't say that the timing will be there that'll recover quick enough that you don't need a backup plan in terms of finding a trade. Be perfectly honest, I would take this time to find a trade. Um, it's always better to have something to fall back on instead of being just constantly a victim to these boom and bust cycles. It's a way to get you the foot in the door into places where you may not think that they need programmers, and or it might be a thing that helps you pivot to another career path that you're not aware of. Um, there's a lot of opportunities in things like nursing, construction, other healthcare. Those are difficult jobs, but they can be incredibly rewarding, and there's going to be a growing and constant demand for them. And so you can build a long-term career in those environments. You can do very well. And in some cases, like people you wouldn't think it, but nurses can be spectacularly well paid. And not only that, but there's career paths to have real growth. Um, you can become a nurse practitioner and really learn a lot about medicine and work with doctors on a much more one-to-one level. And you may be able to do that, and you don't have to go through the whole difficulty of having a medical degree. And that can be really rewarding, not only just financially, but in terms of how you can interact with patients. Now, there's other things too. There's no perfect jobs out there. Everything has its types of stuff. But there are things out there that really are challenging in terms of providing, day-to-day types of things where there's new problems to solve daily and that are helpful to people that don't have anything to do with coding. So just think about that. And again, it's always good to have something to fall back on if you really need to have, extended time away from work. Or just do something like, hey, I want to get a master's degree, but I also don't have a ton of debt. I want to take it a little bit slower so I can do part-time construction or whatever, or part-time nursing. That kind of stuff is great. Here's the other thing that I want to point out, and this is a new wrinkle that I didn't have to deal with in my generation, and this is where I think there's a big generation gap. Is when I became joined excuse me, when I started wasn't accepted, excuse me, let me put it this way. When I was accepted to become a CS major, this is what's weird about that, is you had to be accepted to just become a CS major. You had to take prerequisite classes, get enough of a GPA. In my case, it was 3.5 for these classes in mathematics, physics, and basic computer science to just become a major. And by that is that you could then now take these other classes and eventually graduate with a bachelor's degree if it worked out for you. The reason being was this was 92, and the tools that we needed to do our jobs were enormously expensive. Um, in the engineering building, which was this awful concrete thing at the University of Utah, there's a room on the top floor where you had to swipe your university ID through there and make sure that you're keyed into the system, because inside there was literally $3-4 million worth of workstations, and each workstation was worth $50,000, and were a miracle to work with. They were just, they're very interactive. They had great screens. We had 16 by 1200 Trinitrons that were actually not too bad to look at. And, but we were doing our homework on this very expensive bits of equipment that had to be maintained, updated, and it was expensive to run those resources. And so the programs without a lot of funding would run at a loss. And not only that, but they could not have the resources. You couldn't just have more and more workstations. It just was not viable. So they had to do a lot to make sure that the people that got into the program would graduate, and they did spectacularly well at that. The graduation rates were almost 100%. For when the times I was going around. And the cohort I was with was incredibly successful. A number of people I worked with became professors or worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. They all do very well in their careers. And it's really interesting to see, how that process of being chosen out through those classes worked with being really supported by faculty. We had small class sizes, we had teaching assistants, we had a lot of support to help us get through that process. And that really was nice because we came out into an environment where it was kind of given that these are not a lot of jobs for you, but there's not a lot of people to do this, so we will help support you with this. And for me personally, I actually just went right back and worked on my master's degree because at the same when this was happening, um, they had started introducing the first PCs running NT4. No, excuse me. Actually, they were running NT5 3.5 for a while before they updated to NT4, because we had a class where they exposed us to things like Visual Basic and Windows because someone had gone along, did some internships in HP, and had looked at what the vast majority of people were actually doing in terms of real jobs on the day-to-day stuff. And the demand for Windows programming and working in the Windows environment was through the roof compared to the traditional stuff. And they realized that students need to be exposed to some of these ideas. And I was so interested in it that I actually kind of changed my research focus, or my focus from systems programming into more, object-oriented programming, component programming, and ultimately the UML stuff. And so I went back and got my master's. But the reason I bring this up is that I got my master's, and by the time that was going on, they were still having the workstations. When I went back to my PhD, the workstations were gone, of course. They're all there's limit boxes, but they're still there. But now you can buy a laptop for $200, $300 that has all the power necessary to do all your homework for a 4-year college degree. There are no computer labs anymore. They might have some places where if you want to have to get together in a room, they have good Wi-Fi or maybe even plugged in internet, but you don't have PCs. It just doesn't make sense. Everybody has their own machine. Not only that, but internet connectivity is cheaper. The entire campus is wired now too, as well. It's not like, you have to go to this one lab just to get internet connectivity, So because of that, and because there's an increasing demand for software things, but there wasn't as much growth in programmers, there's this big push an industry in academia and from academia itself to open up computer science programs to a much wider audience. And part of that was actually just necessary. You can't be that strict on gatekeeping when you don't have the resource limits. When you can actually have the professors teach more people can do this. You don't have these fundamental constraints. You need to be more open in enrollment, especially like a school like mine, the University of Utah, which was a state school. And so there's way more people getting out there. So there's this more, everybody needs to learn code, things being the fundamental to coding things. The thing about that is that, yes, there's some demand for it, but it's also because, to be perfectly blunt, the industry did not want to take into account the amount of turnover that they had to deal with because they were burning people out. And they wanted to be able to suppress wages somewhat. So they didn't have to pay people what they were really worth, because they're more worried about their bottom line. And that kind of all became to a head. And then when basically certain resources became more available, especially, this big boom in 2018, where there's this demand, basically cash was cheap, but there's demand for this kind of software, people doing stuff like that. And these companies have this ability to just kind of basically, protectively hire groups. They would just literally hire whole sections of engineers merely so that they wouldn't work somewhere else. This led to this big bubble in employment, and it popped. And of course, the companies will take no responsibility for this and try to gradually move people out, by taking an overall hit to their lower line. No, they just start chopping with a big axis and just letting huge amount of people go and not caring where they end up. So that's bad enough to try to get back into where people are already downsizing and then, trying to say, oh, I'm really actually provide value, and you still have headcount that you need to add in certain areas, and I can be part of that. What comes around now is that, oh, well, where is now all this growth for programmers coming from? There is no growth for programming, even though there's massive amount of investment in tech companies. The problem is that they're all investing in companies that A, don't need a lot of programmers, and B, are creating projects who are in many cases explicitly made to take away the very jobs that the people are looking for. now want. And it's unlike the first dot-com boom, which when it settled down, created a whole new industry, a whole new set of, basically a whole new economic domain that allowed the overall economy to grow, for more people to do jobs, added to overall productivity. This latest round of funding and investment is going into literally having a very few people using a large amount of resources and energy to create tools to replace people that were, because it makes more sense for them to have very few people be even more well paid and more enriched, and not to be burdened by the horrors of having to work with someone who knows less than them to get some of this day-to-day stuff done. Okay, this is ridiculous. Not only that, but I mean, it's one of those things where it's kind of horrifying at the end of the type of the day, because it's undermining everything. And the arrogance of some of these people is just blinding. Yes, there are a few people that will go and get their bachelor's, master's, and PhD from MIT who are absolute geniuses at these things, will go off to these companies, understand this kind of stuff, and they'll go off and get aggregated, and they think they're worth tens of millions or hundreds of millions or whatever. And they're going to do all this stuff, and they're going to be well-intentioned. And because they are so well-trained, but are so not well-socialized, they have no idea of how bad they look and how wrong they are. That the vast majority of people that, do this kind of stuff and actually really do the day-to-day type of stuff and actually really get this grind to work, or going to be the people that need to use your products, aren't that. And taking away their jobs and making them feel bad for not being as productive as something that literally just churns, electrons into basically very questionable code at the best, is an insult to the people who actually wanted to try to do this in the first place. And all I can say here is that I hope that the bubble bursts fast, and it bursts a lot, and a lot of those people get what is coming to them in terms of a cold dose of reality. And I really hope that people come together and do what they have never done before in computer science, but is increasingly necessary, is to organize as a labor force. I'm not saying you have to become a traditional union, but you have to be able to organize and use collective bargaining and the threats of strikes to bring this to heel. This is out of control. And there's no way of getting, the thing about it is that there's less and less gold to be had here. There's less and less people that are going to win the dot-com lottery than they did in the first time. And there's no one outside of the very few people are ever going to really benefit from this. Because at the end of the day, the whole idea about this innovation is that you don't need a lot of programmers to do it. You literally just need an insane amount of hardware resources and some very clever people, and then just have it use everybody else's work, as fodder for training this model, and then turning around and saying, well, you know what, then we're going to replace you. And it's not just the programming, it's, and these other industries are fighting back because they understand the actual essential parts of it, and they're more organized. The reason that AI hasn't completely decimated Hollywood is because the Writers Guild and the String Actors Guild all these other people, and of course the Teamsters and other folks, put them on notice that if they went that route, they would not have anybody to do anything for them. And that needs to happen in a lot more other places. And so the best thing I can say is that, organize if you really want to do this. And given all this, it's really time to have some hard conversations. 20 years ago, I would always have encouraged somebody to get into computer science. 10 years ago, I would have been a little bit reluctant. Today, if I would not tell anybody to do it unless they were absolutely passionate about it and I couldn't dissuade them from otherwise. I would actually tell them to do almost anything else, just because of the way things are and how much disdain that they have for the people that actually created the industry, that and all that money that they're taking advantage now of. And so I have the hard conversations about can you really do this as a career? Do you really want to train yourself to the point where you need to get to go? And do you have to sacrifice too much of yourself as a person to do it? And if any of those answers are I don't think so. Then make a path for you to find something that works better for you. And because don't buy into the hype that one of the things is that the smartest people are coders. It's not true. It's just not true. And you can be very, very successful, very, very intelligent in any kind of work. It has nothing, coding does not have a monopoly on intelligence, you know? And so don't think that there's this trap by, oh, if you don't make it as a coder, you are lesser as a person. Nothing could be further from the truth. And again, don't let anybody assuage you from otherwise, because they are desperately clinging to their own ego. They're trying to prop it up in the face of all the things that are making you worried as well. Anyway, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't. Again, let YouTube know I exist, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.